Vamshi, are we good to go?
Yes, sir.
Vikas, Maya, and Vivek, should we start?
Ready when you are.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Let's do it.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning from whichever part of the world you're joining. Thank you for tuning into the TiE Talks President Series. This is the new series, the new talks that we are having today. Two TiE chapter presidents from Singapore and TiE UK North are going to speak with us. Mr. Viiveck Verma from TiE Hyderabad will be moderating them. But first, certain housekeeping points for all of us. We welcome all of you once again. You'll be on a mute mode for the rest of the session. Should you have any questions to the speakers, please access the chat window and ask your question. The moderator of the session will take it up with the speakers. And if you encounter any troubles with the audio or your internet connection, please seek help from the host and close all the video conferencing tools you may have, which are probably interfering your quality of video. Please do not turn on videos until you're asked to do so. Thank you so much. With that behind me, let me briefly introduce TiE Network, which most of you know is the world's largest network of entrepreneurs. With its humble beginnings in 1992, this group of successful entrepreneurs and corporate executives have grown this organization to a mighty existence of 61 chapters across 14 different countries and a large community of 15,000 plus members, which is growing. So this is the kind of spread. Chapters are spread across the globe, and one such chapter. Each city is a chapter for us. Hyderabad is one such chapter, which is established way back in 1999, and Hyderabad chapter has about 153 charter members. The charter members are those who volunteer to give back to the entrepreneurial community by mentoring, by connecting investors, startups, and grow the startups in their journey, get them corporate access, etc. So Hyderabad has been in the limelight of taking away a few global awards each year in consistency. And thanks for all the support. We impact close to 1,200 startups every year, and we utilize about 1,200 mentoring hours from these charter members. So today, in collaboration with TiE Singapore, which is a very active chapter within the Asia, and the TiE UK North from the Europe, the presidents of these two chapters are here with us. So the session is titled Transforming Lives Digitally, but I'll ask Mr. Viiveck Verma, the moderator for today, to introduce us to the topic, the context, and the speakers for today. Viiveck is a founder and CEO of Upsurge Enterprise Solutions. He's also a senior advisor in the Telangana State Innovation Cell under the government of Telangana. And he co-founded a few angel funds, and he's very active in the entrepreneurship and startup network. He's also the curator and the licensee of TEDx Hyderabad. Besides, he also does social work through his the society that he co-founded, called Society for Advancement of Human Endeavor. Mr. Viiveck, thank you so much. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Funny, and welcome Maya and Vikas. So we will start with just kind of running through a few things that we at TiE on a global basis are putting forward, and what else can we expect from the world's largest entrepreneurial body other than doing the largest entrepreneurial event ever done so far. So if we can move to the next slide. TiE on a global basis kind of puts together a event which so far used to happen in a physical world. Thanks to the world we are getting used to now, we are going to be doing this event in a virtual manner. This is slated to happen between the 8th and the 10th of December. TiE Hyderabad is honored to be hosting this event this year. That it's going to be the world's largest entrepreneurial event. And the reason we say this is because we are looking at 20,000 entrepreneurs attending this event. This is a 55 hours non-stop virtual event, which will start on the 8th of December and carry on till the 10th of December. And during the course of these 55 hours, these 20,000 entrepreneurs will experience 250 plus curated business plans. There are going to be 200 plus marquee investors from around the world. We are putting together some mentoring sessions where people can get on to one-on-one sessions with these mentors and investors. The central theme of this event is to really focus on a few key things. It is to look at the leaders, so we are expecting a few people from country leadership, from company leaderships to come and deliver some keynotes. We are looking at instituting for the first time in the TiE network, the TiE Global Excellence Awards. This hasn't happened so far in TiE, and we will introduce those. Then we will have the panel discussions, some inspiring success stories. And I think the key, which is a differentiator here, is going to be a lot of the speed dating mechanism where mentoring, investing, meet me rooms, networking, and all of this virtually. So it is going to be to give people as good experience as they get in the physical world. In some areas, maybe even better than the physical world, because people can now transition very easily, both geographically and from one session to the other. So that's what we are putting together under the theme of Entrepreneurship 360, new ideas, attracting investment, and scaling. With all of these things, over 300 plus speakers that we are looking at who will come and share their wisdom. And then we get on to a lot of networking one-on-one sessions. So that's something which is happening in December. And if you haven't registered, you should immediately go and register at tgs2020.org, because this is an opportunity which is not something we can miss and we must miss. So please do make sure that you join us for this event later in the year. December 8th to 10th, tgs2020.org is the website. Thank you very much. And with that, let's come to what we are going to be spending the next about 70 odd minutes today. We are going to be talking about transforming lives digitally. And for doing that, we have two extremely eminent speakers who will come and share their perspectives, Maya Hari and Vikas Shah. Let's get to know them a little better. Maya, who is the Managing Director and the Vice President for Twitter Asia Pacific. She's based out of Singapore, besides being the President of TiE Singapore. And she's someone who brings a phenomenal wealth of experience, with a proven track record in mobile and data services, digital data monetization, lifestyle experience across some marquee names, and you can see Twitter, Google, Samsung, Microsoft, Cisco, the brands that people would want to associate with. And that just isn't enough. She's been the winner of the CMO Asia Women Leadership Excellence Award in 2015 and brings a wealth of experience across geographies. And is going to talk to us today from her perspective of this wealth of knowledge, geography, and the companies that she's worked with over the last few decades. So thank you very much, Maya, and welcome to the show today. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Viiveck.
Yeah. And with that, we come to the second person who's going to be speaking to us today is Vikas Shah. Vikas Shah is joining us from UK North. He is the president of the TiE UK North chapter, and he's also the managing director and CEO of Swiscot Group. Again, he is someone who brings a huge wealth of knowledge from the UK perspective, actually from a global perspective. But given that he's based in UK, he's one of UK's highest profile entrepreneurs, and he's a huge business commentator. He is a professor at the MIT Sloan. He's a of Manchester. He's a regular speaker and he hosts conferences around the world. I don't think there are very many people who we want to get to know who Vikas hasn't got into a conversation with already. So that's something he does very, very successfully. Besides that, he runs Swiscot Group. I'm not sure how he finds the time, but he does, and he runs a very successful international trading business, a venture investor in multiple businesses internationally. He's a co-founder of 53 Degrees North, which is a feature film studio. So huge diversity that he brings to the table, and he's been well rewarded and decorated, including being awarded for the economy in Her Majesty the Queen's 2018 honors list. So thank you very much, Vikas, once again for joining us from UK.
Thanks for the invitation.
And more particularly because as we were chatting a little earlier, that UK is just about in the next maybe 20 hours about to get down to a lockdown, second lockdown. So thank you in those situations to be joining us. So with that, we will kind of jump into the conversation for today, and help people understand this topic a little better about transforming life digitally. So let's start with when we talk digital. Let's start with you and kind of get a perspective on what got you to Twitter, which is at the forefront of a lot of this digital transformation that is happening. So can you talk to us a little about your journey so far, with specific reference to digital transformation?
Yeah, thank you, Vivek. It's a real pleasure to come and talk to this group here in TiE Hyderabad. It's very special. Part of my life growing up was a big part of my life growing up was in Mumbai, but there was a small part of my life growing up in Hyderabad as well. So it's a nice connection back to the city. I think the one thing that I learned in my career along the way was that I had this love for technology that was above and beyond everything else, right? And for me, it was about the bleeding edge. The things that were everything innovation is what first and foremost appealed to me. And the second thing that appealed to me about technology and digital in general has been how very quickly a person with perhaps not the most resources in the world can drive change just because of technology, right? And that felt like incredible leverage. And this is really why I've sort of stuck to being in the digital world and technology world all of my career. And my career, interestingly, has spawned across, 2 or 3 continents now. And I've had the privilege of having different perspectives. So early in my career, I started really looking at technology from an enterprise lens and really working through, at Cisco and being in a global role and thinking about the whole world as a canvas and thinking about how to market to, how to sell to clients, but also how to be able to explain technology in a way that is understood by someone who's not a technologist. And that was really the start of my career. Even though I was an engineer, I started more in the business functions, and I had 2 degrees in engineering, but mostly I put it to use for explaining technology. And I think what was really interesting for me was a pivot in my own career after a few years where I learned that my passion lay more on the ability to touch the consumer. And if I had to choose between a B2B and a B2C environment, really, I thought that the B2C environment was always more challenging, but at the same time, also more interesting to me and played well to my skill sets around innovation and technology. And so that sort of brought me to my career for the most part in Asia, between India and Singapore, working for a lot of consumer tech companies, whether it's Google or Microsoft or Samsung, and really bringing together mobile, social, local type of businesses and apps and services. But one of the things that I always use as a litmus test for myself is any company that I have worked for, I always stress test whether I would be a proud consumer of that company. And if I like the product or the service of the company, I feel like I can be proud of being an employee. And so I've used that as a guiding force, in my own choices, whether it was Google or it was, Samsung, I'd been a passionate Samsung phone user from ever since there was an S2, and until date, I am a diehard Samsung phone user, and the same with Twitter, right? And I've spent now 6 years at Twitter and had a few different roles leading a few different types of businesses. But what always drew me to Twitter was the fact that it was a platform that enabled rapid connections and rapid sharing of information in real time. And I had loved that. And I was an entrepreneur a few years ago. And as an entrepreneur, I needed every social platform that I could leverage to be able to bring attention to the business I was running. And that's when I became a Twitter user in the first place. And so that love for that platform essentially brought me to the company as an employee about 6 years ago. And now in that journey, I've had the pleasure of sort of driving product strategy for the first few years, and now currently leadership of our entire APAC business. And it's a really interesting time in the world to lead a platform like Twitter, especially when you need to be able to show multiple sides of every story rather than be polarized in our own consumer worlds. So I'll pause there, but this is really, for me, the story has always been about technology and innovation and being a passionate consumer. Not sure if we lost him.
Hello.
Oh, there we are. I think he's back.
Vivek, are you back?
I'm back. Yes. Yes, I'm back.
Back to you, Vivek. Thank you for asking that question, and loved sharing just the innovation and technology is essentially what drove me to Twitter today.
So might be worthwhile if I just jump in whilst Vivek's resolving his connection, because I know from the chat we had just before, Viiveck, you said that you wanted to know a bit about how the world's changing because of the new technologies that are coming through. And so I'll tell you a story. So I started my first tech business. I was still pretty young. So I was still kind of 14, a long time ago. And back then there was always this constant battle where software improved a bit, then hardware couldn't quite catch up, then hardware took a jump and software came up to catch. And there was always a bit of a tussle. And because of that tussle, you ended up with a pace of innovation, which actually as businesses and as consumers, we could make sense of it, right? The difference now is that technology, so the hardware and the software and the algorithms behind those two are moving so extraordinarily quickly that actually our capability with technology is accelerating far beyond what we as humanity have time to catch up with. So, I know later on we're going to talk to some of the, perhaps the challenges of that, but the real positives are that we are now able to solve some of the, the greatest problems, the greatest challenges. Even as businesses, we're able to, really bring out data from within what we're doing to create new business models, new innovations, and new ways of doing things. And it's also having a really positive impact on people's lives. I've got a few friends in California who are currently on evacuation alert because of the fires. And it's only in the past 2 or 3 years that we've been able to have the technology that means that in real time, people can predict the weather and be able to issue things like evacuation alerts. So our technologies as a species are enabling us to do things which are just extraordinary and extraordinarily complex. And I think for all of us now, it's really incumbent on us to really decide what direction we now go with the complexity and the power that we have. So I think it's actually a really exciting time right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Vikas. I'm sorry I got lost in the middle thanks to technology, but thank you, Vikas, for that perspective from you on the technology. And with that, Maya, coming back to you, I think one of the questions a lot of us as founders kind of struggle with especially when it comes to technology, is this balance between, flexibility and investing in technology, because quite often it's about making large investments, and then we talk about this rapid changing world, and how do you find that right balance so that you're nimble footed, but you're really making a good long-term investment in technology. So being someone who spent a lot of time, I'd like to kind of get your views on how do you find that balance?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Viiveck. I think there's two elements to it. One, I find entrepreneurs, are often very passionate about an idea naturally, right? And without passion, entrepreneurs often may not succeed. But with that passion sometimes comes being wedded to the how behind building out that idea. And that I find is perhaps worth revisiting, is an idea perhaps worth revisiting for entrepreneurs. One of the things that is certainly a reality in my experience, both as an entrepreneur myself in the past, as well as seeing a number of entrepreneurs around me build products or services or companies, the reality is that you live in a time which is rapidly evolving and certainly has a lot of either uncertainty or change agents that are playing out all the time. And for that, I think the more you expect to pivot your business and the more you expect to pivot the direction of your product or service, I think you're in better shape always to say that, hey, I have to think 4 steps ahead. And the best of entrepreneurs, I find, are ones that have thought about building out their platforms or services modularly and building it with a certain amount of flexibility. I don't think you need to allow for every single scenario from a flexibility standpoint, but I think it's really worthwhile thinking about how to layer on things as you go on. One of the biggest challenges I find is very often an entrepreneur has the end state vision and often wants to do too much in the first go, right? But at the same time, I think saying no is probably your big skill in the early days and doing fewer things, but really testing and iterating. But what happens when your testing and iterating starts to show that, hey, you need to pivot in a different direction, right? You thought you were going to be a service, a product offering for a consumer, you then became a SaaS offering. And how do you quickly adapt to that? And the adaptation is both a business model adaptation, but also a technology adaptation. And very often you'll see companies talk about tech debt and being, struggling to get out of tech debt for years because their modularity or infrastructure was not flexible enough. So I do think that it's almost like if I had a magic wand to say every entrepreneur could go to a boot camp that would allow them to think about building modularly, building with flexibility, I think it's almost a 101 level thing that it behooves all of us as entrepreneurs to learn from day one. So I'll pause there, but that's sort of one of the things I think is a real skill.
Thank you, man. And coming from someone who kind of balances between, like you said, the original engineer that you were and the tech kind of knowledge and with running businesses, I think that's always a fine balance that one needs to kind of make between getting too tech and then looking at it from a business perspective and say, okay, where do I find the balance? Because ultimately it's about satisfying the customer need and the scalability and the business side. So thank you for sharing that perspective. And having spent a few minutes talking about technology, Vikas, I want to come to you and with so much focus today on digital transformation, technology, I want to pick your brains on the human factor, because at the end of the day, all of this technology is still being used and driven by the human being. So how are you seeing that relationship, getting impacted between people and technology? With all of these changes happening, you are kind of talking to people, looking at a global perspective. So what's your take on that?
It's a really good question, Viiveck, because when sometimes it's kind of funny when you hear the news and people talk about the economy or the market or the technology sector, and they talk about it like it's the weather. So they talk about sectors like they're these things that are happening somewhere else, but they're not, right? Any economy, and any sector of the economy is basically people doing business with each other. And yes, it might be that the product or the service involves algorithms and systems interacting, but when it comes to the crunch, it's still humans doing business or having conversations or getting to know each other. You still have a predisposition to do business with people that you like or people that you know. All these human interactions are still the backbone of how we do things. And in the digital era, there's two aspects. First of all, it's opened up more potential for more interactions than we've ever had before. And actually, this is where the platforms of social media have opened the world. They've allowed people to make new connections. We've launched businesses based on connections from social media. It's crazy, but that's the reality. But the second part of it is that so for most of us, I don't know the ages of everyone on this call today, but I would suspect that most of us on this call today are not digital natives. We didn't grow up with social media. We didn't grow up with digital technology. So as we were growing up, we were still kind of learning the skills of human interaction, and we recognized the tools and the importance of doing that. And I think that one of the things that we have to be really clear on is that for the generation coming up now, who are immersed in these technologies really from day one, that we do still put effort into making sure that they learn how to build really good, solid human relationships, but also that they learn, how to think about truth, how to think about interaction, how to think about what these social technologies do, because, social media is an amplification of who we are as a species, the good and the bad. And so in some ways, it's not necessarily holding up a mirror, but it's holding up a magnifying glass, right? So, the people that are doing great things, you can see a lot more of that greatness, but also the people in the fringes, you can see a lot more of them too. And so it's important that we give people the tool set to understand what they're seeing, make sense of it, and actually use it for the better of society. But the other thing, just before I finish, is don't forget, this is all really new, right? It took society 3 generations to learn how to cope with the printing press, right? 3 generations. We have gone from having mobile phones the size of a house brick to, sorry, Maya, but the other one, the one that isn't Samsung, in the space of 1 generation, half a generation. And so it's very difficult for us to realize, we think we're really, really smart, but it takes time for society to adapt to these systems, and it will take probably another generation to do that. And sorry, Maya, I know I've disappointed you with my inferior technology, but it does have a very good camera.
Thank you, Vikas. And I think you brought a very important aspect. While all of these technology changes are happening, and they are still the core at the end of the day, is still the human interactions, the human touch, because it's required. Because we should use technology to take that to the next level, rather than letting this to become a hindrance to the relationship. And quite often that fine balance does become a challenge. So thank you for sharing that wonderful perspective. And Maya, with that, moving to you, you briefly mentioned earlier in your first response that you've kind of worked across geographies. So I want to pick your brains. When you worked across geographies, what did you notice in terms of the whole thing about ambition, the problem-solving skills? Because different natives, we're talking about, different people are built differently. And you would have observed that in the different geographies that you have kind of worked on. So how do you see the differences in terms of their problem-solving skills across geographies? Does this determine the number of unicorns we see? Because we obviously see a disproportionate breakup of these unicorns. So does it have anything to do with this? And what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It'd be great to have a line that completely correlates some of these differences between geographies and unicorns. But let me take a stab at that, right? I think the things that I have most noticed as I've worked around the world and with countries and teams around the world, I think one significant difference is the drive and ambition that you see among entrepreneurs. And let's just look at entrepreneurs as a cohort, right? The drive and ambition is in oftentimes the single most sort of deciding factor for me as to how willing to adapt, etc. that entrepreneurs have, and it definitely has a very high correlation in my mind to success. I think the second piece that I think about, and this is interesting, is sort of curiosity, right? And curiosity, before you even get to problem solving skills, I find that there are entrepreneurs who are very curious about what problems they want to solve, or what are the problems that exist in different places that you can solve. And that, especially when you go beyond the confines of one country. I mean, if you take Brazil, for instance, someone setting up an e-commerce offering inside Brazil is a more normal instance. But curiosity factor of entrepreneurs often starts to say, hey, are there patterns beyond this space that I can find? And that mixed with drive, very often I find is an interesting combination. But at the same time, when I compare entrepreneurs or segments of countries around the world, I find the approach to problem solving is quite different. So if you take the American entrepreneurs, the idea is very often, hey, it's a one size fits all for the globe as far as I can go, right? But let me pick a large enough problem that could apply to as many people, and let me build a world-class solution around it, right? And very often localization comes very late in the day for this segment of entrepreneurs.
Later.
On the flip side, you take the Chinese entrepreneurs and you start to see that it's all about wanting to solve localized problems at scale. And so you'll often see that Chinese entrepreneurs will go and build in different countries for that country. And they might trade off globalization, like a single global solution. They'll trade that off very easily, very early in the day. And so I think it's interesting to start to see some of those patterns. One of the things that I think we have in spades is drive among Indian entrepreneurs, and that with a very natural inclination to thinking about technology and technology-oriented solutions, very, very interesting. The outcome that I think there's an opportunity to do more with is this ambition to go beyond the boundaries of the country, right? You have the benefit of having a very large Indian domestic market, which in itself is interesting to solve for and is in itself very diverse. But having such world-class, highly curious entrepreneurs also gives the Indian ecosystem, I think personally, an opportunity to start to think about a global canvas beyond that. And there are many that have already attempted this and starting to attempt it, but I think that the future wave of unicorns, you could start to expect, there's potential there, right? Today, if you see the top 20 companies, technology companies by valuation, you see about 11 are American and 9 are Chinese, right? And in global services or global companies. Mm-hmm. And I think there's room for that to start to change, whether it is from India, whether it is from Australia or Israel. These are all markets where I think the entrepreneurship elements of drive and curiosity and ambition to take on a global mandate could be a very interesting one.
Thank you very much, Maya. And for those of us as entrepreneurs who are tuned in today, I think we should take the advice from Maya more seriously that, while the domestic market is very large in India, and I think, for a lot of us, it could mean our lifetime. But I think if we really want to play a role in the global piece, then I think we need to look at markets beyond India. And I think that's when we can get into that top 20 list that she talked about. So we take this advice and kind of see how do we get to a global level. So thank you, Maya. And Vikas, coming to the global piece, and I want to kind of pick your brain on something which is happening around the world. The whole political leadership changes that we are seeing, and more close to you in the EU, and of course what we are seeing in the US currently, and many other countries around the world, but particularly these two. So what do you see the impact of that on the whole tech investment and innovation and all of that? Because a lot of things are going on today in EU, US, which might have an impact on innovation and tech.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because around the world we're seeing a significant rise. And the EU and the US are really clear examples of this. And but there's plenty more. We're seeing a huge rise in kind of very authoritarian, very insular looking political leadership. And it makes sense because we've had millions of people in every country who've been kind of left behind by economic growth, and they're angry, and they're bringing in people who they feel represent that anger. So I guess it makes sense. But the flip side of it is that quite naturally, those politicians are very protectionist. And so you end up in a situation where countries look inside rather than collaborating. And the secret to investment and the secret to growth is collaboration. The most successful businesses I've ever seen are the ones who collaborate across borders. And that collaboration is often and necessarily facilitated through government, right? So, I've been teaching in Portugal since, for over 10 years almost. And when I first started going to Lisbon, it had just come out of a financial crisis. It was in a real mess. But the government reached out to countries around the world and said, hey, look, we would love to be good at technology. What should we do? How can we work together? Fast forward, Lisbon's probably now number 2 or 3 in Europe in terms of technology after London. It's crazy, right? But when you think about it, it isn't. The reason it worked is because the government went around the world with humility and said, we'd love to be good at this. We currently are not. What do we do and how can we work together? That requires a progressive political leadership rather than a political leadership like we have in the UK that says, we're already a leader. We are the best. Nobody else is anywhere near as good as us. So screw everyone. That does not encourage innovation. The second thing, which is a bit more nuanced, but is also equally important, is that when governments start to become more isolated, they also become much more resistant to foreign investment. So, right now, in the UK, India is one of our most important foreign investment partners. And a protectionist government, a government which is more anti-immigration, does not attract those incredibly bright young Indian students to Oxford, Cambridge, and Manchester to come and study and build businesses. But secondly, it discourages people from coming to invest, to build business, to build a family, to build a home, and to build a life, right? So political posture is deeply linked to investment and technological growth, right? You cannot separate the two. And it's important that all of us on this call realize that we all have a political voice. We can all vote. We can all write to our political leaders. We can let them know how important this is, because the more our country shut down, the less we're going to progress.
And I think that's something we all must kind of play our role, in terms of influencing that economically and in various ways, like you said, because we all have a voice. Because I think it's a very important aspect, and we are seeing that, with some countries like Lisbon that you talked about, Portugal rather, that they have kind of moved forward, and some others which are kind of going back in terms of becoming more protectionist, more inward looking. So I think it's a very important factor. So thank you, Vikas, for bringing that out. And, let's stay with the global citizen. If to again come back to pick your brains a little bit on the technology side. Originally people looked at technology in the places where we expected technology to be used, which is business processing, communication and stuff like that. But over the last few years, we are beginning to see actually technology penetrating into different and new areas where one didn't expect. I don't think people expected the legal services will start using technology, for example. Digital health has been something which happened. So can you talk to us a little about where do you see this deeper penetration of technology as we kind of go forward?
Yeah, I think the the last decade really was about introducing technology to consumers in new and novel ways, right? I mean, the e-commerce wave that we all saw around many parts of the world was very representative of that. It was new. It was a new way to shop. It was bringing the element of convenience. It was bringing the element of access that people didn't have before. I think the decade that we are seeing now, and we're in the, I'd say we're about scratching the surface of that journey now, is actually going and looking at industries that are quite well baked and quite well entrenched in how they operate today, and starting to see first digitization in those industries, and second, I would say the next layer will be automation and innovation beyond digitization. And I think there are great examples of, accounting services that are entirely digital, legal services, HR services, things where you've sort of by now taken for granted that it's too hard to change those processes, or there's too much paperwork there, or there's too much bureaucracy there. And it's great because it also means that technology has seeped in enough into society that now we're tackling what seemed harder at the time, but we're actually getting to build leverage and unlock value from that, right? Take things like the insurance industry going through a big technology wave, really, in not just in how consumers buy insurance, but also going back end and thinking about how do you digitize the process. Same with health, right? We would have never said, hey, we needed the communication technology with video and things to be strong enough and used on a daily basis, as if we don't question it anymore, to now look at, maybe I can talk to a doctor over that and it would be fine, right? And so I think it's a natural and a logical progression, but really a very, very interesting time where we need people who are lawyers, we need people who are doctors to think and imagine what the technology future of their industries are going to be. So it takes the technology trends out of the hands of a few who are in technology today and really puts it in the hands of everyone. And I think that's where we'll see at least the next decade play out. And then beyond that, I think you can start to say, not just how do I digitize and then how do I automate how we're doing things today, but how do I build absolutely new things in those spaces that we haven't thought about. The one flag and a parallel opportunity that I think that goes with this trend is thinking about, now we're talking about data in a very different way. We're talking about legal data, we're talking about health data. And Vikas talked about, the EU really being, and the UK being at the forefront of some of this thinking of regulation and data protection. But that really has to play out in all parts of the world like it has played out in the EU. I don't think there's any escaping regulation. And I think it's an opportunity for entrepreneurs to think through that, actively shape that along with governments, because it's a big deal, right? All of my data now as a consumer has to be protected, and God knows that we are as a society, we're not able to protect data fully well in a completely foolproof way, right? And so I think there's a lot to think about from both the protection of data, but also from thinking about what's the right approach to privacy. How do you not be too restrictive, and yet how do you allow it? So lots of exciting things ahead, I think, on that front, as far as technology becoming more entrenched in our lives.
Yeah, democratization of technology in a certain sense that, we'll get more. And that brings Vikas to something that Maya kind of talked about, because one of the challenges we see with this technology really becoming deep rooted and deep penetration is this whole issue about data privacy. I want to get benefit out of technology. So I want somebody to be able to tell me the trends, but I don't want my data to be revealed. Mm-hmm. I want the data privacy about my data. So where do you find the balance between the two, that everyone else's data is okay, but I'm not willing to give mine? Then how does the technology play out? How do we go to that?
Yeah. So So there's always a missing word when we talk about data privacy, which is trust, right? So we see this play out really clearly during the coronavirus pandemic, because most countries have got some kind of testing app, and look at the way consumers behave. Most consumers in most countries, there are exceptions, but most consumers are happy to trust Google or Apple or Samsung with their data, but not their government. So if the government says we're developing an app, the consumers are like, no. If Apple, Google, and Samsung collaborate and say we're developing an app, the consumers are like, okay, that's fine. Now, that's not about privacy per se, but it's about the fact that you will happily give away an extent of your privacy and liberty if you trust the other party is going to meet you halfway and protect that, right? In the same way that during the first lockdowns, to use the COVID example, most citizens were prepared to give up their liberties because they trusted that the government was doing the right thing, right? So when we talk about data privacy, we have to talk about trust. We have to talk about how companies are protecting and defending the trust that consumers put in them, right? So for example, you end up with some platforms like a Facebook, for example, will never say, will always say, you know, we're super secure, we don't leak anything, nothing breaks, everything's fine. And that's a lie, right? Whereas a lot of other platforms, you know, they were quite open saying, look, we'll do everything we can. And then when things do go wrong, is what do you then do about it? How do you then tackle the leak? How do you then email, you know, all your consumers and say, get things right? And, you know, I'm not just mentioning Twitter because Maya's here, but Twitter's done a very good job of this. You know, over the years, when there has been a data breach or a privacy issue, Twitter's been right on the case saying, here's what happened, change your password, here's what we're going to do, won't happen again. That builds trust, right? And what we need to make sure is that in all of our businesses, through our engagements with government, etc., that alongside recognizing that privacy is a basic human right now, really, as much as it's not enshrined in the UN Declaration as such, we have to make sure that we figure out what can we do to build, maintain, and defend trust.
Good, thank you. Very, very interesting perspective here. That, you know, how to manage this whole data privacy, the secret lies, you know, and how do you, so if some of us are looking at business, building businesses which are around the question of data and the data privacy, I think it's an important factor that Vikas brings out. And with that, Maya, coming to you, you know, with so much upbeat mood about technology, and the last few months have kind of shown that even more than earlier. What's your take on the whole inequality in society that the technology seems to have caused? Because there's one view that the privileged are getting benefited, and, you know, some of the others may not be. So what's your take on this furthering that whole divide?
You know, I wish I had an answer that was positive and uplifting there, but I unfortunately think it's a very, very, very real risk that we're sitting in. And you know, the two examples I would point to, the first thing is that there is, you know, there's a very clear trend that we see of kids not being able to get access to a proper education because in less fortunate families and less fortunate cities, if you will, or economies, because they don't have a computer, they don't know how to use a computer. You know, they barely had the ability to have shoes and clothes and books to fend for themselves in the past. How do they now all of a sudden, within the turn of a year, get a technology-enabled education? It's simply too hard to see that kind of change. The other thing that we've seen is, you know, in a number of, particularly in the West, it's been really hard. In the US, a lot of times kids, the poorer kids in society are kept in school because they get a warm meal in school, in public schools, as part of their schooling. And the big debate about shutting down schools, which you needed to do because of the pandemic, was that, hey, you know, what happens to the meals that the kids had, right? And it is a very, very difficult choice to have to make some of these decisions. But here we are, you know, we're in a situation, we stay hopeful for vaccines to come through, but really, you know, if you believe some of the studies, it's going to be well into the second half of next year before we're really able to start to even imagine coming back to a real world. And so that inequality is frankly really driving that wedge wider and wider. I think it's a good reminder, though, if you take inspiration from this year and say, what are the problems we need to solve as a society? It shows that being able to get connected across the world, across beyond the urbanized areas, beyond the privileged areas, just becomes really important. And thinking innovatively about how do you deliver education, if not to a computer, can you deliver it to a mobile phone? And how do you get basic connectivity for everybody becomes the problem to solve, right? And I think those are tall goals, but at the same time, those are very worthy opportunities to build businesses around. And I frankly don't see any other way for us. As much as we've embraced technology, the mobile phone and a connection to the internet has become, it isn't yet shown on Maslow's pyramid, but it's very much there, right? People would trade off something on the Maslow's pyramid for that internet connection today. So really lots of work to be done in that area.
Yeah, so it's like a necessity now. You can't survive, without that. And while we are staying with this, whole impact of technology on people, Vikas, coming to you, it's not just the economic divide that we talked about with Maya. It's also having an impact on the whole mental state of people with so much use of technology, and I think it's kind of creating a whole impact on the whole usage and the mental impact. And you've been doing some fantastic work in this space in terms of conflict management and in terms of peace building around the world, and especially now in the first few months of COVID, you've done some really remarkable work in that space. So can you share some thoughts on the whole technology and the mental health sides of things?
Yeah, sure. So there's two aspects. So I'm going to split it into global north and global south, which are the new friendly ways of saying developed and non-developed. But in the global north, the mental health impact from technology is a little bit different, right? So in the global north, it tends to be more the case that there's a huge amount of teenage mental health burden due to the pressures of social media. There's also burden on the rest of the society due to polarization and other things that are occurring. In the global south, which is where most people in the world live, and we're talking here about, for example, the African continent, etc., the mental health implications of technology are slightly different, because don't forget, so like, for example, Europe, USA, India, we all came through a technological innovation cycle, right? So India, like the UK, you had awful dial-up, then you had slightly faster dial-up, then you had broadband, then you had very quick broadband and social media. So we've gone through that cycle. So we've had time to adapt a little bit, right? Whereas a lot of countries now, they're going straight from having nothing to having Facebook, right? And they're going from having nothing to having Facebook for free on their mobile phone when they buy it. And the consequence of this is society's never had a chance to figure out how do you deal with the information that you're getting. And so, for example, so In Place of War is a charity that I helped to co-found. We're in 30 countries now, and we use technology in conflict situations as part of doing peace building and building sustainable economic futures. And one of our ethical concerns always is, how do we adapt a society to technology if we're putting it in? So I'll give you an example. We work in Uganda quite a lot. And in the north of Uganda, the south of Uganda is well developed, big cities, lots of great stuff. North of Uganda, where it borders South Sudan, very different situation. Nothing's really recovered post-civil war. However, a lot of Chinese industry comes into the north of Uganda to build power plants, things like that. Now, it's no coincidence that whilst that's happening, you're also getting a huge amount of targeted social media about how climate change is a lie, right? So in this sense, social media is manipulating people to an opinion to enable heavy industry. The same is true of polarization. So in that same part of the world, there's a huge amount of discrimination against people with disabilities. And a lot of that discrimination is fueled by social media memes because people don't understand what's going on, right? So we've got to realize that, what we put out in the world has consequences, and what we take in has consequences. And even for us as in business, right? We all on this call are lucky enough to most likely have relatively comfortable lives. We have to work really hard, but we have enough food on the table every day. And just by virtue of having that, we're doing better than most of civilization. But even we will look on LinkedIn now and again and say, wow, they're doing way better than me and they're 10 years younger. Like, what have I done wrong? So even for us, the way that we compare ourselves with each other, the way that we think everyone else has got a great life and our life sucks, this is the real impact of social media and mental health. So when I'm teaching on MBA programs now, one of the things that I teach the students from day one is that the single most important skill, if you want to succeed in this era, is mental resilience, right? So from day one, I'm trying to encourage them to do mindfulness. I'm trying to encourage them to read about psychology. I'm trying to encourage them to build positive mental health practices into their lives, because we've got so much more coming in that we have to have the resilience to figure out what matters and what doesn't. So that's one really important takeaway for everyone on the call today.
Thank you. And I think that's a very, very important aspect, because mental health, I think, is, this pandemic has really opened our eyes. It's not as if it didn't exist earlier, but I think it's opened our eyes to a lot of us about the challenges that people are facing about mental health, and that could be related also, in addition to what you talked about, which is about technology. It's also because a lot of us are confined to our homes. Earlier you had an opportunity to step out. So if I was in a situation where I was getting affected by all these issues, I at least had an escape mechanism. Now that is also gone, because we are all locked in into our homes and staying with that, which also further adds to that. So thank you for bringing that aspect, and also congratulations for the wonderful work you're doing around 30 countries, Vikas. And I think the world needs more such adoption of technologies to finding conflict solutions. That brings us to another important aspect, Maya, where I want to kind of pick your brains, because you call yourself an urban farmer. So this whole balance between technology and sustainability, because a lot of times people think these are exclusive. Either you can look at technology or you can have sustainable. The two don't seem to go in our minds, at least, as hand in hand. But you seem to have found a method to balance that too, and you're not just doing it yourself as an urban farmer, but in our conversation earlier, you really mentioned these are some of the important values you're working with the next generation, starting with your own children. So can you talk to us a little about how do you find that balance between technology and sustainability?
Yeah, I have to tell you, the root cause to really thinking about sustainability for me personally was articulated probably by Paul Pullman the best. He's the ex-chairman of, he's the ex-CEO of Unilever. And he has been one of the leaders that has really believed in sustainability for a very long time. And he actually said, it's not a question of trading off profits and sustainability today. It's the fact that if in 20 years, the people that are buying our products don't even exist in the cities that we serve today, what's our business then, right? If the planet starts to really take a nosedive, in 30 years, we may look very, very different as a planet. And, it's not even 30 years, it doesn't even sound that far, because we're seeing what's happening in San Francisco right now with the fires. We've started this year with Australian bushfires, and you have hurricanes, and we're really seeing a lot of climate change come through. And so that was the starting point for me. And I started to think about, how do I want to try and make an impact in the world? And I started with two things. One is looking at my own life and saying, how can I bring sustainability into my life? And then the second was, as an investor, what do I do and where do I put my money, right? And so those are the two things that I took an approach on. I started an attempt about 5 years ago to be sustainable on vegetables and herbs and fruits that I grow on my own. I will tell you, it's a very long journey ahead. I'm very much not there yet, but I've made some progress. But I think the interesting piece is, through this process, as a person in technology, I always went back to, how can I speed up the desired outcome with technology. And that's where I started, from urban farming to thinking about production of food in sustainable ways using hydroponic farming, modernizing the principles of how you farm and do agriculture. These are all things as a hobby I did on my rooftop, and I do on my rooftop. So I don't own a farm per se, but there's a lot of thinking that spawned on, agriculture and farmers in general, and how much they could think about just being more responsible in how they farm, modernizing their infrastructure, but without trading off the wrong way, right? A lot of technology often comes with the requirement of electricity, and just putting everything that's powered by electricity doesn't help, right? So you also need to think about, are you using renewable energy sources? Are you not? But in general, frankly, I think this space is a very interesting one for entrepreneurs and people who are interested in solving this problem, to think about how to build technology enabled scale and solutions, but do it in a way that is thoughtful to the planet. And so a lot of companies that I look at today are companies that are investing in modernizing farming. Interestingly, there's a young startup I saw recently that takes some older principles of how our predecessors lived, right? Using natural cooling materials, using coconut fiber and things like that, to be able to build pellets for shipping containers. So it's very interesting, the use of information of how traditionally we have been very responsible with the planet, and mixing that with technology to bring scale and impact. So I don't actually think that they are divorced from one another. I think the only way we can achieve the impact we want sooner for our planet is actually to bring the two together. It just needs thoughtfulness, and the trade-offs we make are never easy in that space.
Can I just quickly comment on this one as well?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
I think what Maya said was really inspiring, and it's just a really quick reflection for all of us in the group, right? Where, we as Maya said, we have to move towards more sustainable food sourcing. Like, there's no argument. But isn't it odd that if we'd have gone back 2 years, and if we'd have all been sat there going, what will it take for the world to switch to sustainable farming? Nobody would have said it's a global pandemic, right? But even in Europe, because our international supply chains are now broken because no one can go anywhere, all of a sudden people are getting involved in urban farming. So sometimes it's the most unexpected event that spurs the spark of innovation. But it just really inspiring, Maya, to hear what you're doing in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Maya, for bringing that. And because that brings me to another very interesting aspect in our run up to this event today. And we were talking about, and you talked about this whole craziness of the technology bubble, and how you've seen a comparison between the early 90s when we had this bubble create, and you see some of that kind of now. So can you share your perspective? It was very interesting talking about that. It'll be good for our audience to hear your perspective on this bubble.
Yeah. So look, we're in a bubble. I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any particular, conspiracy saying that. If you take the largest technology companies in the world, the valuations just simply don't make sense over the long term. There's a huge amount of capital that's being put into businesses based on continued exponential future growth, as opposed to it being really linked with the reality of growth underneath. The difference is now there's a lot more capital to sustain those bubbles. In the 90s, that there simply wasn't. When you look at the kind of price earnings ratios of all the major technology companies in the world, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that something's gone really fundamentally wrong in where capital is being allocated. So there's two things for that. The first thing, which is the good part of the story, right? These are highly innovative businesses, and the capital that they've got, because of the volume of capital coming into those businesses, their cost of capital is basically zero. And so as a result of that, they're innovating at a pace which is spitting out products and services which consumers are really, really benefiting from. And that's a really good thing. The downside, of course, is that in any market, whether it's in pharmaceuticals or technology or any market, when you artificially create dominant market players through to an availability of capital, you stifle innovation at the grassroots level. So in that situation, much like it was in the 1990s, if you have the seed of a great idea, you get bought out for a ton of money and your idea is basically gone. So what we need to do is realize that actually in some way bubbles are necessary because we need those gigantic companies to bring innovation through. But if we're going to allow that to happen, we also need policies, frameworks, and investors who are prepared to support seed businesses over a longer term period so that we do also get that next layer of innovation. I think the other difference was in the 1990s, that bubble burst really quickly, right? As in, we all went to bed one night, woke up the following day, world gone bust, and the whole world ended, right? That was a very different scenario. I think here we've formed a bubble, and that bubble is now moving between segments of the technology industry. So, we went from search to blockchain and then to other areas. And it will eventually just maybe create a gradual reduction back to normal value.
Fantastic. Very, very interesting perspective, in terms of how they are same and how they are different, and how the whole world is going to get impacted by that. And Maya, with that, I come to a question which, when Vikas mentioned in his response, this is becoming such a buzzword now for any new startup. When you look at their pitches, it's almost like the hashtags you have on Twitter, that it must have, artificial intelligence, it must have robotics, it must have machine learning, it must have blockchain. So it's become very fashionable that every business must have all of these ingredients in it. Only then it's an investable, scalable business. Again, as a technology person, what's your take on this? Is it really required that everything needs to have everything?
Absolutely not. I think that the real, if you look at a pitch deck, if an investor looks at a pitch deck of a company bringing in a technology pitch, I think the most important thing is, can that person understand what you do very quickly, right? And that is the litmus test that I think very often we miss as entrepreneurs in the run to say, I am the Uber of this industry, or I have AI and robotics of this, And it's I understand why people use these buzzwords, because valuations often tend to follow certain cycles of certain sub-industries or sub-technologies. But at the same time, the risk that people run is using all these buzzwords and leaving the person not clear on the other end as to what the business actually does. And I think I would any day pick what the business actually does to be the first and foremost thing to clearly solve for and articulate. And then think about, does it align with business models that find favorable valuations, right? From a pragmatic perspective, sure, if you can explain the business, if you have two different business models, you may want to pick one that has more favorable valuations in how you project it. But I absolutely think that people who do well ultimately, who find believers, who find investors, who find scale, know exactly what they do and articulate it really well. So I definitely am not in the buzzword camp, Viveck.
Yeah. Good insight again, because for a lot of us as entrepreneurs, I think that's an important message, that we have to keep our focus on the problem we are trying to solve and the solution we are finding. And if that solution involves some of these buzzwords, so be it. It's very good, but it doesn't necessarily need to have all of these. And I see that also, because as an investor, I see a lot of pitches, and today it has become fashionable to have, and sometimes you are sitting there wondering that what's that got to do with either the problem or the solution. It just seems like a misfit here. So thank you, Maya. And with Vikas, with that, I come to you for the last question of the day, is that, with this whole technology adoption, and the way the world is evolving, what do you see as the future? if we were to do crystal ball
Yeah.
gazing, and I think earlier we said crystal ball gazing meant 5 to 10 years. Now it probably means the next 2 to 3 years. What do you see the outlook for the world?
Do you know, I think if I knew that, I'd be joining you from my yacht somewhere in the Mediterranean, the truth, I think one of the things that I've always been really curious about is that we only refer to technology as things that have microprocessors and transistors, right? Whereas, pens are a technology, hammers are a technology. We as a species have never been without technology, because even the earliest evidence of Homo sapiens, we had stone tools and things. So technology is just a part of us, and it always has been, and it always will be. And every single day, thousands of new innovations are being created, and it's the ones that are most useful to us as a society for what we need right now, which are the ones that win. And if we look back, and I realize that things are very easy to make sense when you look back, but if we look at something like Amazon or something like Twitter or something like Facebook, the timing of those innovations was at a stage where society needed that, right? So when Twitter came out, for example, we'd all started to get smartphones. We were starting to get used to social media because of MySpace and things, but we needed a platform for that to happen really rapidly. Twitter came along, perfect, right? Amazon came along at the cusp when we were ready for e-commerce at scale. And so if we really want to understand what technologies will be adopted in the future, we need to understand, what are the real problems in society right now? And there's this big virus going around, which could give us some clues. But also, what is society really crying out for? Like, it's crying out for trust. It's crying out for ethics and moral decency from technology companies. It's crying out for better public health solutions. There's a big basket of areas. And I think rather than thinking about what will be the technologies that will be successful, it's more healthy to think about what are the areas where technology is most likely to make a big impact for the future of civilization. My one prediction, though, which I will stand by, is that I think that the next group of wealthiest people on the planet will be social entrepreneurs and not capitalist entrepreneurs.
Fantastic. I think that's a very, very interesting perspective, and I kind of tend to align with you on that. And I think a lot of the problems, and is about adoption of technology rather than inventing something new. I think it's about seeing what are the problems and how do we solve those problems. And I'll take a few audience questions here, Maya. I'll start with a question which maybe you can give us an answer to. It's a question from Subhashisan. There is a general perception that while we are technologically very, very well connected, we are actually getting increasingly disconnected socially. And what's your kind of take on that? I think we touched upon it briefly, but maybe you can give some insights on that.
Yeah, I do think that there's a real humanity challenge with the amount of siloed communication we're doing. On one hand, it's really interesting that you can now connect to anybody in the world around a topic that you're really keen to know about, and being at Twitter, that's sort of the core opportunity set that we try to solve. But on the other hand, you also see people spend an inordinate amount of time as a relationship with their mobile phone, and therefore start to lose touch with the ability to talk to people, to go and spend some time physically hanging out with each other. And I think this connects a little bit to the mental health issues that we talked about before, but it is also an interesting way where I actually see the world going in cycles on this one. And I think that there is a resurgence now of people trying, the new social networks, or the networks of the future will start to bring back that physical connection of people, but based on different interests. Maybe it's not people you hang out with because they're your friends or your family, but who is in your vicinity that can be your community. And there's a interesting service platform called as Nextdoor in the US, which is very interesting. It authenticates and verifies that people are in the community, in the neighborhood that they belong to, and they're building these microcosms and communities. You know, it gives you a chance to come back and bring that connection back to the real world. But I think I anticipate we'll see more of that, right? We're unlikely as a humanity, as a society, to lose ourselves entirely in the technology world and never be able to come back. It's a cyclical phase, in my opinion.
Thank you, Maya. And Vikas, we have a question for you from Ram Shankar. He's asking that extreme protectionism and extreme liberalism are both dangerous to people. However, when do you think the government should or must do to strike a balance between these two ideologies?
Yeah, it's really interesting because we've historically, it's tended to be the extreme right that's been, you know, the culprit of so many things. But actually, you know, Ram's quite right, which is, you know, it's both ends of the spectrum, which can be extraordinarily damaging to society. In fact, any extreme ideology can be damaging. And in terms of government response to this, this comes back to how we as people interact with technology. Because if you think of the basic jobs of government, you know, government should be the individuals who tell you sometimes what you don't want to hear because it's for the good of society. But we live in very partisan times where, you know, the very fast news cycle and social media trends drive policy, and that's very dangerous, right? So we've seen in the US, for example, that, you know, the entire presidency was driven by, you know, very amplified voices. So there's a degree to which we have to figure out what is that new settlement going to be like? How does government change? And some of this is actually linked to how we use technology to engage citizenry closer with government, right? So how do we make sure that government uses technology to bring much greater transparency to what they're doing, to engage people more in what they're doing, and to bring people with them more in what they're doing? Because what we're seeing right now is symptomatic of a disconnection between government and citizenry. So I really hope that by increasing that link, by making a deeper link between government and civil society, that actually we will have a healthier relationship, meaning that it's not just the loudest voices that have the influence, but all the voices.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Vikas. And we've had some very interesting conversations, but largely it's been more serious stuff. And before I let both of you go, I thought I'll kind of bring in some fun element. I think with technology, that's also an important piece that we can't forget. We are human beings and we must have some fun. So I have some few rapid fire questions for both of you. One word or maximum 2 words, and your first responses. So no deep thoughts, no deep thinking. So let me start with you, Maya. If you were stranded in an island, what are the 2 things you want with you?
Oh, good music and my husband.
Wow, he's a lucky man. Vikas, what compliments do you receive the most?
Do I receive the most?
Yes.
That my cat's really cute.
Good one.
I wish I was joking.
Maya, coming to you, what was the last time you laughed out loud?
Oh, last night, dinner with friends, good friends.
Yeah, fantastic. That's an important element in our lives, and we must not forget that. Vikas, what's been the most memorable moment in your life so far?
Oh, definitely my wedding day. It wasn't that long ago, only 5 years, but definitely my wedding day.
Thank you. Maya, one thing that you would change about yourself?
Oh, that's a tough one. So many things I would change about myself. But
no, just one. Just
okay.
one.
Okay, one would be I'd say my fear of failure, if I could. I know it's a bit serious for a rapid fire question, but I think I do have from time to time fear of failure. I wish I didn't.
And that's interesting to know because, someone who's been at the position you have is also wanting to change the one thing, which is the fear of failure. So thank you. Thank you for saying that out, Maya. And Vikas, what is the first thing you think of in the morning when you get up? What's the first thoughts?
Wow. Usually,
Not the
usually
not
something
the
very
naughty ones.
mundane like, what am I late for today? But it sounds really funny, but normally the first thing I think about in the morning is if my cat tends to sleep on me. So I'm like, what's going on?
And Maya, you talked about the fear of failure, but what do you fear the most?
I don't know. I think I can't be without my friends and family. So being stranded away from them is my ultimate fear, and especially if it was dark or for some reason. So have to have my crew around me.
Okay, wonderful. And Vikas, what will you never do?
Put profit before principles, because I never want to do anything that means I can't sleep at night.
That brings me to the last rapid fire question for both of you. What's been the biggest mistake you've made in your life? We'll start with you, Maya.
Oof. Hey, you said fun, but these are all very serious ones. Right? I'm really trying to give you fun, but this is okay. In all honesty, it was rushing back to join Twitter 6 years ago when my dad passed away, and he passed away in India, and I was going back and forth a lot. And the thing I regret is that I didn't give myself enough time to be with everyone, to be there for everyone, but also for me to grieve. So sorry that it's such a serious one, but that's the truth.
Yeah. Thank you, Maya, for again sharing that with us. Vikas, for you?
Yeah, and sorry, I can't kind of raise the mood of the room either, but I think it was just not getting treated for mental health problems for a long time, because instead of going to see the doctor, I kept listening to people that were like, do a motivational seminar or whatever. And I think my life would be very different had I been treated a decade sooner for kind of anxiety and depression. I just wish I'd have done that.
Okay, so maybe I should be careful with that question, but thank you for both of you sharing some candid views and insights that you did so far, and that brings us to the end of the session we've had with both of you. So really both of you for sharing some really wonderful insights on transforming lives digitally, and I hope a lot of people are taking away from these insights. And with that, I'd like to welcome Murli, who has just joined us, Murli Bukapatnam, who is the past president of TiE Hyderabad, chairman of Voxy Technologies, who's also a past a member of the Global Board of Trustees, very dear friend, not just to me, but to both of you. And I'd like to invite Murli now to talk to all of us. So Murli, over to you.
Thank you, Vivek. Maya and Vikas, I have to confess one thing. This is the first TiE Talks I am attending, and I couldn't have been more thrilled to attend a TiE Talks by two very good friends, giving and pouring their heart. It is so heartwarming, Maya, to hear, especially in your last one when you told about how quickly you joined back to Twitter, and I so much related that to myself when my father had passed away and I was shifting back and forth from US to India. And you're absolutely right. And because if I remember, the most happiest moment from friend side was when you announce your engagement to team of your friends middle of the night from UK to what is that, Houston, we need some help or whatever. Come again, Vikas?
I remember we were at Ashok's house.
Yes, so I say that that's the, at least from my point of view, I think that is the most happiest moment.
So Murali knew about it before my wife did, because I had and I was in Houston before I then met her in New York to ask the questions. And Murali knew before she did.
So there you go. So we do. So the life. So Maya, that I guess that brings back to why it is so important to have friends and family around. And I am more like you, that if I get stranded and if I don't have my friends and family, I think I would go bonkers, and probably I'll take the deep dive into the water next to the island, right? Guys, I'm not going to let you both go just with TiE talks. As you both know, TiE Hyderabad, I've reached out to both of you. TiE Hyderabad is hosting this year's TiE Global Summit on December 8th, 9th, 10th. We absolutely need both of your help in getting the most coveted speakers. I know Maya, Puneet is handling it from Singapore, but I just want you guys to make that as important as you would make any other event. And I know, because you mentioned about Manchester, India, some kind of a session in that way. But I just wanted this particular moment. See, the listeners enjoyed you both so much. I'm pretty sure we would want to give the similar opportunity for all the 20,000 people who are going to be at the TiE Global Summit in December. So I don't want to rob that opportunity from the entrepreneurs to listen to you both, and also to the other speakers, mentors, startup from the lovely chapters you both are heading. It is so wonderful to have you guys on Saturday afternoon and share such a invaluable insights with all of us. And I really, I'm not kidding, Vivek will kill me, but this is my first TiE talk, and I'm absolutely enjoyed it. And Vivek, thank you so much for such a lovely moderation and bringing all of the pieces together. Thank you once again, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, Murli, and thank you, Vikas and Maya. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great rest of the evening ahead.
Thank you, and look forward to one
Great sharing, Viveck. You did a great job.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye. Thank you, Vivek.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.